It's great to have you all on Candid Leadership today. This is such a delight, especially for our listeners and the people that recommended both of you to come on this podcast.
It's an honor to be here. And I love seeing the books in your background.
Yes, that's right. Both of them. They're read and tabbed.
Excellent.
And highlighted with lots of circles on these are things I say in my head. Someone put it in writing. Thank you.
Exactly. We love to see that.
So what I love about, radical candors that kick off and then Just Work, it really puts things into practice. So you both founded Just Work to help the organization both boost trust and collaboration in the workplace. Can you talk a little bit to our audience about how you created this company and some of the philosophy behind it?
Absolutely. In many ways, as I was writing Just Work, which is really about creating just work environments in which we can just work and also where there's justice. I realized when I started the book, I never liked to think of myself as a victim, but even less did I want to think of myself as a perpetrator or a failed leader. And yet I had to come to grips with the fact that I had played all of those roles at different times. And as I was finishing the book, I thought, people are going to need to put these ideas into practice, and they're going to need more. Reading a book is awesome, but very few people change their behavior because they read a book. And I know this from Radical Candor. And so I started looking for someone who had really been walking this walk for a long time, who really knew what it took to roll out DE&I practices, who really understood what it was to be a people leader. In many ways, I view myself at this company as sort of like the person who had a root canal. But that doesn't, just because I've had a root canal doesn't mean I know how to be a dentist. And so I was thrilled to meet Trier, who really knows where the rubber meets the road on how to put into practice ideas that will change things.
Yeah. And Candace, it's so great to be having this conversation with a fellow veteran, Academy graduate, although not from the, Air Force Academy, West Point. It's totally fine. No one's perfect. Someone has to do it.
But we can both say beat Navy.
That's right. We can both say beat Navy. That's absolutely right. I have found myself continuing to do work in this space because, as you know, in the military, we say we take care of our people and the people take care of the mission. And every year that I'm further and further removed from my military experience, it becomes so much more apparent that I think that the military has some incredible strengths and no organization is perfect, but the military definitely does a much better job of really understanding what it means to take care of your people truly. And so there's this huge opportunity to help organizations and companies understand what that means and get it right. Because when we take care of our people and we create an optimized experience for them, we're going to get their best work so that they can just work. And so my mission and journey of trying to help organizations do that with Kim's Just Work framework, putting that together, created Just Work, the company, where we take the framework and so many other, ideas and philosophies and frameworks and go into organizations and help them, take care of their people and get it right.
Well, that's fantastic. And I love the fact that both of you both grapple together with theory and practice and put it together into something that's really exploded. And but the ecosystem isn't quite there yet. And you see so many different factors that are really exacerbating workplace injustices. And some of those most damaging sources are people doing things that they don't even know or are aware that are really just not helpful or in some ways really bad. How do you work to define what those injustices are? And what are some of the most prevalent examples that you've seen to kind of overcome that as well? How are you helping to negate those hurtful comments?
So one of the things that I have tried to do in this book and that Trier and I are doing as we work with companies is to give very clear names and definitions for the root causes of workplace injustice. And so there's three different things that I think are at the center that we often conflate as one: bias, prejudice, and bullying. And so we offer some very simple definitions. Bias is not meaning it, usually unconscious. Prejudice is meaning it, very conscious belief. And bullying is simply being mean or meaning harm. And so I think one of the things that we've worked hard to do is to help people distinguish between these things and know how to respond, and help leaders know what they can do. So I'll talk about what we as sort of people harmed by bias, prejudice, and bullying, and what upstanders can do to respond to these things. And then we can also talk to you about what leaders can do to make these things happen more often. So as an upstander, what's a good response to bias if you notice it? It is what Trier and I call the I statement. I don't think you meant that the way it sounded. Whereas if it is prejudice, you need an it statement, because if an I statement invites someone in to understand things from your perspective, when you're confronting prejudice, they don't care about your perspective. They have a different belief. And so how do you manage that? So an it statement can appeal to the law, it can appeal to HR policy, or it can appeal to common sense. So Trier was one time working with a hiring manager on a hiring committee, and everyone who had interviewed, all the candidates, agreed that the very best candidate was a Black woman who had worn her hair out naturally in the interview process. And the hiring manager said, we can't move to offer with this person because of her hair, because we can't put that hair in front of the business. So now this is not unconscious bias. She's rationalizing her decision. And so what do you say in a situation like that? It is illegal, which it is in a lot of states, not to hire someone because of their hair. It is an HR violation, which it was at that company, not to hire someone because of their hair, or simply, it is ridiculous not to hire the most qualified candidate because of their hair. There are other times, though, when someone is just being mean, when they're bullying you. And there, an I statement is not going to work. You don't want to invite the bully in closer. And neither is an it statement. They don't care where that line is. So you need a you statement, which sort of pushes the person away. My daughter explained this to me, actually, when she was in third grade. She was getting bullied on the playground. And I was suggesting to her, and this is a mistake we make all the time, to use an I statement. I feel sad when you blah, blah, blah. And she said, Mom, why would I tell him that he made me sad? He was trying to make me sad. Why would I tell him he succeeded? And I thought, you know what? That is a really good point. And so here you need a you statement. You can't talk to me like that. Or if that feels like it might escalate too much, what's going on for you here? Or even just, where'd you get that shirt? The idea is that now you're in the active role and that bully is having to answer your question. So that's some sort of things we can do, but these things almost never happen. Upstanders almost never do this. And as people harmed, we almost never know what to say. So what can leaders do to help?
Yeah. And Candace, one thing to highlight, it's so powerful when you first get introduced to the framework and you're reading the book, because for me, if you would have asked me, Trier, have you ever been bullied in your career? I'd be like, no. Have you met me? Like, you come for me, I'm going to come for you, right? Like, not happening with Captain Bryant. Outside of basic training, right? We'll just call that a wash of bullying. But what's interesting is that this framework really forced me to rethink my experiences that I had had in the military and, sharpen my own perspective on what I had gone through and what I hadn't gone through, and then how I reacted, not only as a person who's potentially been harmed, but as a leader of like, hey, I wasn't able to name it. It's one thing that I wasn't able to name bullying for my own experiences, but imagine though, as a leader, all the times that I couldn't identify bullying in that way. So that means that I wasn't intervening and stepping in. And so I think it's really powerful for us not only to understand how to identify the differences between bias, prejudice, and bullying for our own experiences, but as leaders to really be able to identify when this is happening in our organizations so that we know what to do with it. So what do we do? So with bias, one of the things that leaders have to understand is that we have to disrupt bias in the moment when it happens. Otherwise, our silence reinforces it. So how do we do that? We call those bias disruptors. And so there's 3 things that leaders need to roll out and implement bias disruptors within their organization. The first is a shared vocabulary. And shared vocabulary is a word or a phrase that whenever someone says it, the whole team knows we are disrupting bias right now. We are flagging bias. We have teams that say, hey, bias alert. We've got teams that, on our team, we wave a purple flag or we say purple flag, and then Kim bought a purple flag. It's a friendly purple flag, not like a red aggressive flag. Or we've got one company where cats are very prominent in their culture, so they meow at each other in a meeting. We'll let you know how that's going to finish working out. But if someone meows in a meeting, that's how they disrupt bias, right? So now that we know that we're going to flag it, okay, we flagged the bias, we're disrupting it. What happens next? Then we need a shared norm of how to respond, because those are the times once the bias is flagged, that's where things get uncomfortable and people are unsure. But if we have a shared norm on how to respond, then we can manage people's expectations. They know what's going to happen, and then it becomes more comfortable. And so that shared norm could say, hey, thanks for flagging. Yes, I get it. I'm working on it. Thank you. Or thanks for flagging, but I don't understand. Can we connect after the meeting so I can better understand? Or what's great in this Zoom environment is, can you drop a link in the chat that better understands? So we can still get the work done, right? We still got to get shit done, but we can disrupt bias and stop that, so we're not reinforcing it. And then the final thing is a shared for everyone on the team that we're going to do this at least once in every meeting. Because just because someone isn't flagging the bias in that meeting, it doesn't mean it didn't happen. It either means that someone may not have had the courage to step in and call someone in on that feedback, or we weren't noticing it. And that's also just an understanding of our proximity to different cultures and different experiences of how quickly we're going to be able to really, notice that bias and then also flag it. So that's what we do with bias.
That's fantastic. And I think something both of you noted on, this is really everyone's involvement. It's not just a leader issue, middle management and people that are just entering into the workforce. We all play a role in eradicating inequality in the workplace. But at different levels, it really takes different aspects of it. And for the fact that I love the purple flag, especially because right now I work in a joint organization. So your book is purple, the flag was purple, everything in my life, purple is my new theme color, which is also, royalty, right? So we are all there together doing this, rowing with a purple oar. But what do those leaders also have to do? I mean, there's more of a weight on the shoulders of those leading in my world in national security, but in your business world, how do you advise C-suite executives on their examples?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the really important thing is that leaders have to take responsibility for preventing these things from happening. And yet it's impossible to prevent them from happening. That's the great thing about being a leader. Your job is to do the impossible. And so when they do happen, when they do occur, you've got to respond in a way that prevents them from happening again. And so if it is a leader's job to roll out these bias disruptors and also to make themselves sort of the example of how to get this right. In other words, when a leader says, I am working on my biased language, I am saying you guys when I mean you all, or I'm saying blind spot when I mean something I didn't notice, so when a leader can call out their own language and ask for help from the organization, I want you all to flag me when I say you guys. Instead of you all, or whatever it is that the leader is working on. It almost, I mean, it does matter what it is, but as long as there's something concrete and tangible, and then other people can bring their perspective, can flag other biases. So I think, yeah, go ahead, Trier.
People leading by example and folks will follow. And it's so powerful. The other thing is leaders and everyone, we can also call ourselves in, right? Kim and I will do it all the time. Like Kim will say something, she'll be like, oh, purple flag on myself, right? Or I'll be like, oh, purple flag. But the thing is that, you can cultivate a culture where it is welcomed and it's desired and people see it as a learning moment, right? Because I mean, we love being in meetings where the concept of like disrupting bias and purple flag, it's very easy to implement, right? Very quickly. Sometimes even on a podcast, they'll be like, oh, purple flag, like there's one, right? And what's interesting about that though, is that it becomes a learning moment. There are so many examples that we've seen and used, or where we're in meetings where someone will say, oh, purple flag, on this. And it's like, oh, we didn't know that, right? So we're constantly learning. There is no one pager that's going to tell you these are all the biased things you shouldn't say or do, right? It's really just it's as diverse as people in our lives and our experiences are. And so we have to cultivate the environment to where we can flag and call people in so that we're constantly learning. And again, not reinforcing the bias by just defaulting to silence.
In fact, the other day, Trier and I were recording a podcast together, and I said, HR serves three masters. And immediately I saw the purple flag. I knew this was a moment where I knew what I had done wrong. Why was I using a slavery metaphor unnecessarily? And so I just said to Trier, we have this norm. Thank you for pointing it out. I get it. I'm working on it. We hit pause and we re-recorded. It was a big deal. But slavery, I don't mean to say that slavery was not a big deal. It was a terror. It was one of the horrible ordeals that so many people in our country's early history went through. But it was the moment was no big deal. We re-recorded it, and it didn't hurt our ability to get work done together. In fact, I think it helped us work more honestly together. That she flagged it and we re-recorded it, and it was a better podcast as a result. So better work. We just worked, and we also worked more justly together as a result of the purple flag. So it's a small example, but an important one. And when this happens every day in every meeting, we can really change. Unconscious bias is a pattern, and we can change. We are pattern makers as human beings, and we're not helpless victims of patterns. We can change these patterns.
I love that. And the fact that after shutting the book, closing it, I noticed that the next day I went into work and I said, all right, hey guys, let's get together. And I stopped myself and I said, I have worked very hard to say teammates for years. Every note I write, I'm constantly saying, all right, team or teammates. Because if you're receiving that, all of a sudden you're a part of it. Yeah. And it's just like immediately caught myself. So I think that's fantastic that not only you can help each other out, you become stronger as an organization too, because everybody feels like they belong in this just work culture. Fantastic. Let's move and turn a little bit towards bullying. And these are one of the issues that you write about. And especially, I know Trier understands that this was the slogan of toxic work environment for a long time was it hit a lot of drumbeats in the military. But from what I've seen, read, and heard most recently on another podcast you were on, you talk about bullying really being 65% top down. And so because this podcast speaks primarily to leaders, how can you work to let leaders know and ensure that they're not a part of that 65%? And how do they address this?
Yeah. One thing I do want to call it from a military perspective. So we are working with the Navy with the Sexual Assault Prevention Office. And we really spend a lot of time talking about bullying because the definition of just, hey, bullying is being mean. It's harder in the military, right? Because we're taught this line and this balance of when you need to change your tone and talking to your troops and so forth and so on, right? It's situational. And so I think that the part though, for military folks to really understand when it comes to bullying, because there is bullying in the military, it's the intent to cause harm. That's the difference, right? And so there's a lot of bullying in basic training, but we're not causing harm. There's a purpose behind it. So it's but what's that bullying where there's an intent to cause harm? And how do we prevent those situations from occurring within our organizations? Because so much of it does happen top down. And so, yeah, I'll let Kim speak to that. But I just wanted to throw that out there for the military audience. It's really being mean with the intent to cause harm. That's the part that we really have to focus on.
Yeah, that's meaning harm would probably have been a better. I wish I had gotten to you, Trier, when I was still editing the book. It would have been a better definition. So I think one of the things that leaders can do to make sure that the leaders underneath them are not bullying their people is to create real consequences for bullying. So, and there's three basic categories of consequences. One is conversational. Learning how to shut the bully down in the meeting is a really important part of leadership, and something I am willing to bet happens better in the military than it does in the civilian sector. And then the second thing is you want to make sure that you are creating compensation consequences for bullying. Very often, people who engage in bullying, they create an advantage for themselves and a disadvantage for everyone who they work with, for the broader team. So it's sort of a local maximum. And very often, strangely, we reward people who indulge in bullying with higher ratings because they get results, but they don't get results collectively. They just for themselves. So they harm results overall. And sometimes we pay them bigger bonuses. We reward them with salary bumps, and that is a mistake. Behavior rewarded is behavior that's going to escalate. And finally, you've got to make sure that there are career consequences for bullying. You don't want to promote bullies. There's a point in every company's history when the assholes begin to win. And that is the point when the company begins to lose. And so and everybody laughs when I say that because we've all noticed it happening in organizations where we've worked. And it is a tragic moment. And it's the responsibility of the leaders to make sure that doesn't happen. Now, the other question is, bullying becomes actually harassment. It becomes something much worse when you layer power on top. So I think the other really important thing is to make sure that you're creating checks and balances. This is a fundamental part of our governmental system. I've also worked at a number of companies, tech companies in particular, that have done a reasonable job making sure there are checks and balances so that no one person in the organization has unilateral decision-making authority at any stage of the employee life cycle. So no one person gets to decide who they hire, who they promote, who they fire, who they pay bonuses to. And when there are these checks and balances, it's much less likely that power is going to really ruin the esprit de corps in your organization.
Yeah, the other thing is, one of the things I think the military does a really good job in is that they do such an exceptional job of defining things that are important, right? So I think that those in the military, regardless if you're an officer or enlisted, you can define leadership and followership because they spend so much time making sure that you know both, regardless of, we're constantly going back and forth in those and wearing those hats and those roles, but it's so that you can model that behavior. And so I think what even is just as powerful is like, how are your units and your organizations like giving people the definitions of bias, prejudice, and bullying, so that we say, hey, if this is the action, this is the behavior that you model, we will call it bullying, and that's not acceptable, right? And I think that there are some poor behaviors that we don't want to talk about, but we need to define them so that people recognize it, understand what it is, and then you can have change behavior, but also so that leaders can hold people accountable and then put these solutions into place so that we can, get rid of these type of behaviors within our organizations.
No, I think that's fantastic. And both of you wrap that so well with leadership. At the end of the day, we're just trying to get to the end result. But if we don't understand that it really is people first, if your only mission, and mission always is very important, but if you forget that people aspect of it, you miss the whole point. Great points. Let's move now to where we're at in this, post-pandemic world. The phrase of new normal is quite often thrown around, but how we behave at work has been altered quite a bit due to remote work. And for those listeners in the intelligence community, I do understand you enjoyed inside the office the entire time through the pandemic, but a large number of people went remote. And so now that it's shifted and changed, and many of you in different areas are still kind of working in this hybrid-like environment, how has that made things easier or more complex in some areas?
Well, I think one way that it's made things easier is if we're not physically together, there's going to be fewer physical violations. And so I think as we come back together in the real world physically, we have a real opportunity to create a culture of consent. And a culture of consent is pretty simple. If you want to touch someone, it's your responsibility to know whether or not they want to be touched in that way, even if it's just a handshake. And if they don't want to be touched, don't touch. And don't put pressure on the person to touch you. And if you're not sure, don't touch and don't put pressure. It's really not that complicated. And yet it doesn't happen. And so I think if we can use the handshake if we can rethink the handshake, and very consciously rethink it in a way that reinforces a culture of consent, where you don't automatically stick your hand out. Maybe you say, would you prefer an elbow bump? Put your hand on your chest, whatever it is. Then if we do that in the context of an explicit culture of consent, we have an opportunity to really make a big difference in the workplace.
There's also some interesting data and analysis that's been done. There was one organization, Project Include, they did this fantastic in-depth analysis that basically said that remote work due to COVID has actually exacerbated harm for particularly underrepresented professionals, whether that's gender, race, ethnicity, however you sit at the intersections of your identities, we're seeing increased harm. Yet then just Best Places to Work, they also did an analysis and they said, hey, people are really enjoying working from home, especially underrepresented professionals, and they want to continue to work at home. And so Kim and I had this really interesting conversation of how can both be true? How are we seeing more harm done, yet underrepresented professionals want to continue to work from home? And I think what's happening is that we are seeing increased harm, but by working from home, there is a wall, right? There's this protective wall of Zoom. I can turn my camera off. Someone says something that's biased or exhibits prejudice. Afterwards, I can immediately go to my safe space and kind of regroup, versus when you're in the office, you can't. And so I think that what's happening is that we are seeing more harm, especially for those that are underrepresented, but by working from home, they have more opportunities to protect themselves, to kind of re-energize themselves and get back out there of dealing with the day-to-day. And so what I would encourage leaders to understand, though, is how are we checking in and understanding what's going on in those populations, and thinking even more broadly outside of just race, gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, but also parents, caregivers, right? Those are a population that have just really, really had a difficult year. And what are people going on? And this is where I actually think the military is exceptional, but continuing to do that consistently and just having those personal conversations, that is where the military just really gets it right so well, that we're telling civilian organizations, hey, you really need to check in and ask those questions. But it really goes a long way, because we are seeing more workplace harm in these remote environments.
And I think part of the reason why we're seeing that is that when we are on a screen instead of in person, we lose a lot of the context and the texture of real life. And so we're maybe even more likely to see someone through the lens of our unconscious stereotypes or even our conscious stereotypes than we would be if we actually saw them. If you see someone in real life, you notice their shoes, and it's something to talk about as opposed to just their identity. So I think one of the things that leaders can do is to create a little bit more space at the beginning of small meetings, for example, for chit chat. So we get to know each other at a human level. What's going on? And now all of a sudden we see ourselves and each other as fully formed human beings, and not this little tiny square on our computers. Another thing that is interesting is bullying. One form of bullying is what I call bloviating bullshit. And these are the people in a meeting. Am I allowed to curse on is that okay?
I have a great editor, so if we can't, I think everyone will understand context is key.
Bloviating BS, we'll call it that. And these are the people who come into a meeting who don't know any more than anyone else, but who talk 50% of the time instead of their allotted 10% of the time or whatever. And you can begin actually, this happens more over Zoom, I think, than in real life. But you can begin to measure it more easily now. And I think helping people understand, hey, there were 10 people in the meeting and you only spoke 2% of the time, or hey, there were 10 people in the meeting and you spoke 60% of the time. People can begin to self-regulate if you offer them these kinds of metrics.
That's great advice. And I've actually implemented, I've heard you speak of this, and implementing that, letting people know you've got 2 minutes and timers start now. You better come with the best advice possible, because if you limit a meeting to a half hour, people get really quick about what's important. And then afterwards, we're going to have the conversation part following. It's made a huge difference in my organization. Ladies, I wanted to thank you both for being on my podcast today. This is fantastic. Our listeners at Candid Leadership are definitely in for a treat as they've listened to this entire episode. Is there anything else you'd like to touch on, and where can they pick up this fantastic book that you've just authored?
If you come to our site, justworktogether.com, you can see you can buy the book there, and you can also learn more about our frameworks and our services. Radical Candor is radicalcandor.com, and you can also learn more there. So thank you so much for this conversation. I really thoroughly enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us.